March 25th, 1957, the Six Nations, France, Western Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, meet in Italy to sign the Treaty of Rome, laying the groundwork for the modern European Union. Just 12 years earlier, these countries were bombing each other. Now, former enemies were voluntarily sharing sovereignty. The strategy, championed by architect Jean Monnet, was practical. Start by putting the raw materials of war, coal and steel, under joint control. By making conflict economically impossible, cooperation could spread step by step from economics to politics. Nearly 70 years later, this experiment has grown into a massive system, with a legal framework governing 450 million people, a Supreme Court that overrides national laws, a borderless single market, and a currency used by 350 million people, and a directly elected parliament. While imperfect and often frustrating, it creates a shared space of rights and rules that shape daily European life. Yet, the EU is just one part of the story. Europe actually holds the densest network of international cooperation in the world. Hi everyone, welcome or welcome back to my channel. If it's your first time, I'm so happy you're here. My name is Marianne and here I talk about geopolitics. So if this is something that you're interested in, please don't hesitate to subscribe. It's been a while since we looked at global institutions, so today I'm turning the spotlight onto the European Union and Europe's regional landscape, while excluding NATO, on which I want to make a separate video. This is part of a bigger series on how these regional bodies work, and more importantly, how they impact people living under them. Regional integration in Europe has been primarily driven by the European Union and encompasses the single market, the Eurozone, and cross-border initiatives, serving as a global model for transnational cooperation and economic interdependence. It is unique and offers a level of institutional integration that no other region in the world has successfully replicated. Let's see why. So, what exactly is the EU? It's not a country. It doesn't have an army. It doesn't raise taxes directly. Citizens remain French, German, Spanish, not primarily European. There is no EU army or EU president directly elected with a democratic mandate for the whole union. It is an international organization, but it's also not a normal international organization. A normal international organization like the United Nations or the World Trade Organization operates between states. It creates rules that binds governments. Those governments then implement them in their own legal systems, in their own ways, on their own timeline. The EU does something genuinely different, and it comes down to how they write the rules. In many areas, the EU issues regulations that directly apply across the bloc, and no national parliament input is required. There is no French version or German version, there's just the European one. This is what legal scholars call the principle of direct effect, and it was not written into the original treaties. It was invented by the Court of Justice of the European Union in 1963, a court that decided by its own initiative that European law was different from international law, a new legal order. Welcome back to the court because it's one of the most extraordinary judicial institutions in the world. But it's not always that absolute. For many other policies, the EU uses directive which set the goal, but let national governments decide exactly how they want to write that in their own local law. The EU operates on the principle of primacy. When European law and national law are in conflict, European law wins. Not because EU member states are forced, but because they voluntarily agreed that this is how the system works. Their sovereignty is constrained by their membership. This is a form of shared sovereignty. Neither the national model with the one sovereign entity, nor the international model, where each states preserve their sovereignty, but something in between, a system where sovereignty is held and exercised in common. It sits between a state and international organization, but how did it evolve from 6 countries signing a coal and steel treaty to this? The European Steel and Coal Community, signed in Paris in 1951, was the seed. 6 countries joined with one purpose: joint management of coal and steel production, supervised by a supranational high authority whose decisions were binding on all 6. And it worked. So the member states decided to do more. In 1957, they signed the Treaty of Rome to create the European Economic Community and extended integration to a full common market, free movement of goods, services, capital, and eventually people. 4 years later, they were actually joint institutions, a single council of ministers, a commission, a parliament, which was then just consultative, and a court of justice serving all three communities. Then the community went through decades of incremental expansion. More policy areas were brought under European authority, more powers given to the parliament, direct elections were instituted for the parliament in 1979, environmental policy, consumer protection, social policy, areas that had originally been purely national got European dimensions. And more countries joined too. The Single European Act in 1986 was a breakthrough. It allowed harmonization of laws across the single market by majority rather than unanimity, which unblocked years of paralysis. 6 years later, the Treaty of Maastricht in 1992 was transformative. It created the European Union formally and introduced the plan for a single currency. It added cooperation in foreign policy and justice. It created European citizenship. It introduced the concept of subsidiarity, the principle that the EU should only act where action at European level is generally more effective than national action, as member states were increasingly nervous about how much they had handed over. Lisbon in 2009, the most recent major reform, simplified the architecture, gave the European Parliament real legislative power over most EU laws, created a permanent president of the European Council, and streamlined decision making. It is the framework under which the EU operates today. So, who does what in the EU? Today, the EU has 7 official institutions. Let's go through them. The European Council, this is where the heads of state and government of all member states meet at least 4 times a year, where Macron, Scholz, Melanie, Tusk set big strategic decisions, but they don't pass laws and don't manage day to day. They set the political agenda and resolve the big political deadlocks. It has a permanent president, which is currently a position meant to provide continuity and represent the EU externally at heads of state level. And there is the Council of Ministers, or Council of the EU, often just called Council. This is where the ministers of each member state meet in different formation depending on the topic. Finance ministers for economic policy, environment ministers for environment policy. This is the voice of national governments in EU legislation. For most EU laws, the Council and the Parliament both have to agree. They are co-legislators. The Council votes by qualified majority for most things, meaning 55% of member states representing 65% of EU population must agree. But in some sensitive areas like taxation, foreign policy, constitutional changes, it still requires unanimity, giving every member state a veto. The European Parliament is directly elected by European citizens every 5 years. It has 720 MEPs and sits in Strasbourg with committee work in Brussels and administration in Luxembourg. A compromise that everyone finds slightly absurd, but nobody can change without a treaty revision. The Parliament has gone from a consultative body with no real power in the 50s to a co-legislator to the Council on virtually all EU law. It elects the President of the Commission, approves the whole Commission, and can dismiss it with a vote of no confidence. A note on democracy: the EU's democratic structure is layered and indirect in ways that can be confusing. MEPs are elected directly, and the government is also elected directly and sends ministers to the Council. The Council and the Parliament together elect and oversee the Commission. It's not the same as a parliamentary democracy, but a form of representative democracy with real elections, oversight, and accountability still. Then there is the European Commission. It has 27 commissioners, one for each member state, and is led by a president today, Ursula von der Leyen. The European Commission has a near monopoly on legislative initiative in the EU, that is, to propose a new law, with special initiative rights for other institutions applying only in specific cases. It doesn't represent national interests. Commissioners are supposed to be independent from their home governments, but represent the general interest of the EU as a whole. It also acts as the guardian of treaties, meaning it monitors whether member states are actually implementing and complying with EU law and can take them to court if they're not. The Commission is, in a real sense, both the EU's government and its chief prosecutor. The Commission manages the EU budget, around 170 billion a year, and its priorities are reflected in where that money goes. Agricultural subsidies, regional development funds, research programs, the Green Deal, digital policy, and so on. The Court of Justice has, since the 1960s, built the entire legal architecture of European integration. Through its judgments, often going far beyond what the treaty literally said, using the logic of integration to derive principles the member states had never explicitly agreed to. Two judgments in particular changed everything. In 1963, in Wangen and Laws, the court decided that European law creates rights for individuals, rights they can invoke directly before their national courts. In 1964, the court went further and established the primacy of EU law over national law, including constitutions. The court said if national law could override EU law, the whole system would collapse. These two decisions, made by 9 judges, changed the constitutional order of the entire continent. The member states hadn't explicitly agreed to either principle. The court read them out of the structure and purpose of the treaties. And member states over time accepted them because the alternative was the dissolution of the entire project they built. The court has continued this creative jurisprudence across decades, inventing state liability for violations of EU law, meaning a government that fails to implement a directive can be sued by citizens for damages. And EU law in general has been very creative in solving any legal trouble that the EU finds itself in. Let's move to the European Central Bank. It is independent of all EU political institutions. It sits in Frankfurt and sets monetary policy for all countries within the Eurozone. It was tested almost to destruction in the 2008 2012 financial crisis when the ECB president Mario Draghi famously stated that the ECB would do whatever it takes to preserve the euro, backed by nothing more than his authority and the credibility of the institution. But it was enough to stop the market panic. That's an enormous amount of institutional trust for a body that existed only since 1999. There is also the European Court of Auditors, which acts as the EU's independent financial watchdog, checking that EU funds are correctly collected and spent. The EU has brought a massive unified market, the free movement of people and goods, and the establishment of global regulatory standards for the citizens of its member states. It has vastly contributed to preserving peace and supporting the economic prosperity and development in Europe. Here are some examples of what the EU brings in day-to-day life to European populations and beyond. As part of the EU, but also including non-EU members, the EU Customs Union eliminates tariffs on trade between member states and establishes a standardized tax rate on goods entering from outside the bloc, facilitating trade and access to products across the EU. The EU also adopted a single currency, the euro, binding Europe's economies closer together, and its benefits range from everyday convenience for travelers to massive economic advantages for global trade. At this stage, not all EU member states have adopted it, although they are technically required to adopt the euro once they have met the strict economic and legal conditions known as the convergence criteria. Denmark, and before Brexit, the UK, were the only member states with a legally binding permanent treaty opt-out that exempted them from ever having to join. While nations like Poland, Czechia, Hungary, Romania, and Sweden are legally obliged to adopt the euro, they can delay joining indefinitely by intentionally postponing alignment with the entry criteria, often driven, as in Sweden's case, by domestic opposition. The GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, is an EU law. So when a website in an EU country asks for cookie consent, that's an EU law. When Apple, Google, or Meta get fined billions of euros for privacy violations or anti-competitive behavior, that's the EU's competition enforcement. The right to be forgotten, being able to ask Google to remove personal information from search results, comes from the EU data protection law. Roaming charges within the EU are regulated and have been dramatically reduced by EU telecommunication rules. At work, the EU sets minimum standards for working hours, maternity leave, health and safety, non discrimination, and equal pay across 29 countries. The portability of social security entitlements when changing jobs and moving between EU countries is partly an EU achievement. Anti discrimination protections based on race, gender, religion, disability, age, and sexual orientation all have EU underpinning in them. The Schengen area, which allows passport free movement across 27 countries, including several non EU members like Switzerland and Norway, is an EU achievement. And when you buy things, EU competition law prevents companies from forming cartels or abusing dominant market positions. Food is subjected to EU food safety regulations. The recent common phone charger rule, one phone charger across the whole European countries, is EU. Consumer protection laws on warranties, returns, misleading advertising all have a European floor. On the environment, EU law covers emissions trading, air quality standards, water quality standards, and restrictions on toxic chemicals in products. The Green Deal, the most ambitious climate policy package in the world, is an EU project. On human rights, the EU has the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which has the same legal status as the treaties themselves. It guarantees every person within the EU the right to life, liberty, privacy, non discrimination, freedom of expression, and dozens of other rights. These are enforceable before national courts and the Court of Justice. The EU has an accountability deficit, democratic gaps. Some of those criticisms have merits, but the alternative to Brussels interference in most of these areas is 27 different national standards, a fragmented market, weaker consumption protection, and governments and multinationals with far more unchecked power over the people. And the EU provides several channels for citizen engagement beyond voting for MEPs. The European Citizens Initiative allows citizens to collect 1 million signatures across at least 7 member states to call on the Commission to propose legislation on a topic. It's bureaucratically demanding, but it has been used successfully, notably on environmental and farming issues. Any citizen can petition the European Parliament on matters of EU law affecting them. A European ombudsman investigates complaints of maladministration by EU institutions, and of course, voting in European elections. Turnout has been historically poor, around 40% before a surge to 50% in 2019 and 2024. But the parliament's growing power means the elections are now generally consequential. Simultaneously, the EU's regulatory power forces non EU countries and multinational businesses to adopt EU standards simply to participate in European supply chain. Now let's step outside of the EU to look at a different kind of European organization. One with a very different membership, a very different mandate, and a very different approach. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, it has 57 participating states. Not just European ones, the United States is a member, Canada is a member as well, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Tajikistan, etc. It has no founding treaty in a traditional sense. It grew out of a Cold War diplomatic process, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, that produced the Helsinki Final Act in 1975, the document signed by 35 states, including the Soviet Union and all of its satellites, the United States, and all Western European democracies. It was, in Cold War terms, a grand bargain. The West accepted the post-World War II borders in Europe, effectively legitimizing Soviet control over Eastern Europe, and the Soviet bloc accepted a set of commitments on human rights and fundamental freedoms that they had no intention of honoring, but which their own dissidents would use against them in the next 15 years. The Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia, Solidarity in Poland, the human rights movement across the Soviet bloc all invoked Helsinki. When those regimes fell in 1989, the CSCE, as it was called then, was already the forum where the East and West were talking to each other about human rights, democracy, security for a decade and a half. Today, the OSCE has 3 areas of activity. The political military dimension covers conventional arms control, military transparency, and early warning of conflicts. The OSCE runs the Vienna Document, a system under which member states notify each other of military exercises above certain thresholds and accept inspection visits. The idea is to reduce miscalculation. But during the Russia Ukraine crisis, OSCE monitoring missions were amongst the last international bodies with access to conflict areas. The economic and environmental dimension covers economic cooperation, anti corruption efforts, and environmental challenges. This is the least developed basket and arguably the most underfunded. The ODIHR, the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, based in Warsaw, runs the world's most extensive election observation program. It sends hundreds of observers in elections across the OSCE area, produces detailed reports on whether elections met international standards, and has issued withering assessments of elections in Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and to a lesser degree of problems in established democracies too. Nobody is immune from the ODIHR scrutiny in principle. The OSCE also provide early warning and quiet diplomacy on minority rights issues before they become violent conflicts, managing tensions in the Baltic states after 1991, when large Russian-speaking minorities were suddenly living in new independent states with different citizenship rules. The OSCE also runs field operations in conflict zones in Georgia, Moldova, the Balkans, and Central Asia, but Russia forced the closure of the mission in Ukraine in 2022. The OSCE's fundamental tension is the consensus rule. That is both its strength and its weakness. It allows the OSCE to maintain a forum where adversaries can talk to each other. During the worst moments of the Russia Ukraine war, the OSCE's communication channels were among the few that remained partially open, but Russia has used consensus to block or water down virtually every OSCE response to its own behavior. But its consensus dependence allows its most problematic members to systematically undermine its stated values. And then there is the Council of Europe. Don't confuse it with the European Council, the EU body where the heads of state meet. The Council of Europe was founded in 1949 and is based in Strasbourg. It is a completely separate organization from the EU. It focuses directly on democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. With 46 member states, including countries outside the EU like Georgia and Armenia, and Russia until its expulsion in 2022, its crowning achievement is the European Convention on Human Rights, that was signed in 1950. Also based in Strasbourg, the European Court of Human Rights, the ECHR, lets individuals sue their own government for violating convention rights, such as free speech, privacy, religion, or freedom from torture, once national legal options are exhausted. This unique supranational court can rule against member states and order them to change their laws. The court has issued landmark binding judgments across Europe, including in the UK prisoner voting rights, and in Russia on Chechnya, the treatment of the opposition, and LGBTQ plus rights, which Russia ignored until its expulsion. It also ruled against Turkey on free speech and treatment of journalists and political prisoners, on Italy and Greece against immigration detention conditions, and France on religious freedom. The Council of Europe's Committee of Ministers supervise compliance, and defiance triggers a political crisis. The UK's friction with the court highlights the ongoing tension between national sovereignty and human rights enforcement. Notably, Brexit did not change this, since the ECHR is separate from the EU. Beyond the ECHR, the Council of Europe manages roughly 210 multilateral treaties on issues like corruption and bioethics. This includes the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, a major global treaty ratified by non members like the US and Japan. The Council also runs two other key bodies: the Venice Commission, an advisory group providing legal opinion on constitutional law and democracy. It issued critical, largely ignored opinions on Hungary's constitutional changes under Orban and has reviewed laws in Ukraine, Georgia, and Turkey. And there is also the Congress of Local and Regional Authorities, which monitors democracy at the subnational level. The relationship between the EU and the ECHR system is complex. The EU has its own Charter of Fundamental Rights enforced by its own court, the Court of Justice of the EU. While All EU member states are individually bound by the ECHR. The EU as an institution is not. Though the Lisbon Treaty obliges the EU to formally join the ECHR, the procedure is still ongoing after a first rejection by the Court of Justice of the European Union in 2014. Let's take a quick tour of the other organizations that make Europe's institutional landscape. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, founded in 1949, is not a purely European institution as the US and Canada are members. Its purpose is collective defense. An attack on one member is an attack on all. It has no legislative function, no human rights mandate, no court. It is, at its core, a political and military alliance. But 23 of the EU's 27 member states are NATO members, and the relationship between EU defense ambitions and NATO structures is one of the central and resolved question of European security today. Then there is the OECD, originally created in 1948 as the OEEC to manage the Marshall Plan, and it has evolved today as the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It is a think tank and a coordination body for market economies. It has 38 member states today globally, including Japan, South Korea, Australia, and Mexico. Its function is primarily analytical and normative, producing research, setting standards, and applying peer pressure. It doesn't legislate, but it influences through expertise and consensus. Then there is the EFTA, the European Free Trade Association, created in 1960 as an alternative to the European Economic Community for countries that wanted free trade without political integration. It originally had 7 members. Today it has only 4: Switzerland, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. 3 of those 4, everyone except Switzerland, participate in the European Economic Area, a framework that gives them full access to the EU single market in exchange for applying EU single market rules without having a vote in making them. It's sometimes called fax democracy by critics. You receive the rules, but you don't make them. Switzerland has a different arrangement, dozens of bilateral agreements with the EU that are constantly updated and renegotiated. I just want to clarify here that the reason why these countries accept this situation is because they have an economic interest in having access to the EU single markets. Beyond large-scale institutions like the European Union, European integration is also driven by smaller sub-regional groups such as the Nordic Council that foster closer cooperation among a specific subset of nations sharing distinct geographic, historical, or cultural ties. So, in conclusion, what has Europe's institutional architecture achieved? The main success is that Europe has had no war between its major powers since 1945. It is a result of the deliberate strategy of economic and legal integration that the Treaty of Rome launched. Jean Monnet's insight that peace could be built through interdependence has held. The European single market is an extraordinary achievement. It has generated wealth, reduced transaction costs, and made European business globally competitive in ways they would not have been as the 27 separate markets. The ECHR system has generally improved human rights protections across 46 countries. It documents, adjudicates, and sometimes corrects state actions when they imprison journalists, torture prisoners, or discriminate against minorities. The OSCE maintained dialogue during the Cold War and has created monitoring tools for elections and conflicts that don't exist anywhere else. But there are also limits. The EU's democratic deficit remains a major critic. Consequential decisions are made behind closed doors of the Council of Members. The Commission is appointed rather than elected, and voter turnout stays lower than national elections. This leaves the democratic chain between voters and decisions long and opaque. The bloc has also staggered through severe crises. The 2010-2012 Eurozone crisis, triggered by the 2008 crash, imposed devastating austerity on Southern Europe. The 2015 migration crisis exposed deep, bitter divisions between member states. And Brexit served as both a symptom and cause of public disillusionment with the European project, though its fallout today could actually strengthen the case for staying in the EU. The OSCE's consensus requirement has allowed authoritarian states to systematically use the organization's credibility while flouting its standards. The Council of Europe's court faces persistent non-compliance, but overall, Europe's institutions represent something genuinely rare in international history, an attempt to manage the tensions of the sovereign state system, not by conquest, not by dominance, but by law, by shared institutions, and by voluntary limitation of sovereignty in the common interest. They are imperfect, they are bureaucratic, they are sometimes frustratingly slow. They generate genuine tensions between national democracy and supranational authority, but they have achieved significant progress for the populations of their member states. So that's it on the European regional organizations and integration. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and I intend to continue looking at regional organizations and integration across the world. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you very soon in the next one.